Hi everyone, Professor King here. In this video, I'm going to be discussing uh, Michel Foucault's discussion. I'm being very redundant, I know. I'm going to be discussing Michel Foucault's take on the Panopticon and Panopticism, which is not an idea that he came up with originally. It's an idea that he kind of takes from Jeremy Bentham, who is a very famous economist from 19th century England. Foucault is alive about 100 years later in France. And then he starts getting big around like the 1960s, 1970s. So this will help to facilitate discussions that we're going to have later in the class. It is a little bit of a challenging text, but it's short. And there are some really helpful notes already taken on the text in the PDF that you'll find on Canvas. So I hope it's helpful, and I hope you get something out of it, especially as it relates to chapter 14 of Everything's an Argument, which is the chapter on visual arguments. So I'm going to take it to a share screen really quickly, keeping that notion of visual arguments in mind. So the first thing I've pulled up here for you is, this is actually an article from the New York Times, but it has a very helpful image of the Panopticon. And I figured if we're talking about visual arguments, this will be a helpful way to illustrate those things we're talking about. So if we look at the Panopticon here, it's a structure, it's a building. And we ask, what kind of building is it? Well, it's a carceral building, meaning it's essentially a prison, right? So we have here in the center of this circular structure, this would be kind of like if it were sliced, I don't know, vertical? If it were sliced down the middle and we could look inside, right? But otherwise, if we think about it as a whole, it's a circular structure. And in the middle of this circle is the lifeguard tower. And you usually have like one or two guards here. You can see they have little lights that they can shine. All of these in the background here are the prisoner cells. They look kind of what we would assume a standard prisoner cell to look like for the most part. We've got the barbed wire here. There, you may have Googled images or seen the images from the book itself, from Foucault's Discipline and Punish, of what a panopticon looks like and what each particular cell looks like, what its view looks like. And there are different iterations of this, different examples, but they all, for the most part, kind of follow this structural model that Bentham originally came up with. And so the first question I have for you is, if we're thinking about chapter 14 and we're thinking about how arguments can, they don't just exist in words, they don't just exist on the page, they don't just exist spoken, they don't just exist in songs, but they can be in images, even in architectural structures like these, in the clothes we wear, in the nonverbal cues we give off to people, in our behavior. Then, as the book is titled, right, as our textbook is titled, Everything is an Argument. And so when we think about visual arguments, we have to think beyond the word. And I would imagine that as generations progress with more and more access to the internet and experience with the internet, we will start to see a savviness of visual argument that maybe people from my generation or older don't necessarily have as much of, because we were exposed to less visual imagery. And we did have television and film, things like that before. So we've always had these sort of visual arguments at the ready. But with things like Instagram, with social media, visual argument is a very commonplace thing. We don't necessarily need words to understand the argument that a person or a structure or a work of art or an image is creating. And so if we look at this and we think about this panopticon, this building, this structure as an argument, and if we remember, argument involves rhetorical situations, which involve the speaker or writer orator, right? They involve the audience, they involve the purpose for sharing the argument, and within that triangle, we have the message or the argument itself, right? We've talked about this in previous videos, so I'm not going to belabor that point too much. But if we think about those elements of argument and how they change among and within various situations, and if any part of those arguments change, then all of it changes, right? We have to think about what the argument here is in this image. For example, if we're thinking about the guards who are performing surveillance on the prisoners, if they are the rhetors, the orators, the arguers, the creators of the text, what message are they sending to the prisoners? What's their purpose? You know, if we see like their big flashlight flashing on a room right here, what's their purpose in sending the message? Especially as Foucault points out, right? These prisoners can't see each other. They can only see a sliver, and sometimes they can't even see the guards. So what message is that sending to the prisoner? What's the purpose of that message, of sending that message to the prisoner? What is the message? Why would the guards be sending it? Now we can think about this another way. If we think about the person who created the structure, or the group of people who created this carceral structure, right? This prison, if you will, this panopticon. What's their argument? And what if their audience is not only the prisoners, but other people viewing the panopticon from the outside? Maybe, you know, someone who's involved in the prison industrial complex. What's the argument? What's the purpose of the message, et cetera, right? So we start thinking about not just words as argument, but structures, but everything, once again, as an argument. So I just wanted to give you this nice little visual representation so we had it, but I'm going to take it to the notes that I've created. Some of these will be on the web teach that you'll see for this assignment, but there's a little more detail here that I want to cover a little bit more. So the first thing you'll want to do, if you haven't already done so, is to review chapter 14 from Everything's an Argument, which is the chapter on visual arguments. If you're watching this video at a later date and there's been, you know, probably another update to Everything's an Argument, and the chapter on visual arguments is a chapter other than chapter 14, just look for it. Keep that in mind. How do visual arguments play into the two main phenomena that Foucault discusses in this excerpt? The first one is not, it's interesting because we don't start with the panopticon. What we start with, oddly enough, in this text that was written, you know, 50 or 60 years ago, what we start with is a pandemic, and not the COVID pandemic, right? We're talking about the end of the 17th century in Europe, when the second plague epidemic was happening. And so we start to see what Foucault discusses, which is similar to in some ways, but very different in other ways of what we're seeing now, right? Which is people sort of cloistered or quarantined in their homes, a lot of surveillance among these European cities. And if you think about Europe, you know, the cities aren't like, let's say, Brea or Yorba Linda, where there's these sort of like, you know, suburban McMansions. Everything's closer together, right? We're in these kind of smaller European buildings, right? I mean, some people live on farms and so they live kind of spread out, but if we're talking about European cities, and as we know, cities are places where pandemics can spread relatively quickly, we start to think visually about these arguments, right? So as you're thinking about that, right, visualize the scenes. And as you're visualizing the scenes, ask yourself, what arguments is Foucault implying or leading up to by describing life in the homes of these towns and districts in the way that he's describing them? Maybe do a comparison and contrast to how it's different than the lives we lead now, that you lead. maybe how it's the same. And then on page 199 and a little bit earlier, he talks about the exile of the lepers. Lepers are people with kind of boils all over their skin, and that leprosy is another form of contagion. And Foucault talks about these people being exiled, like sent to, to other places. And he talks about the division between the quote, division between the normal and the abnormal. Okay. And there's a very specific, again, purpose why he's sharing this argument. This would probably be like an argument of fact. We could call it an argument of facts. He's kind of giving us this historical information, this historical data to tell us something. So what is he telling us when he's talking about the exile of the lepers, right? And the division between the normal and the abnormal, and why is this discussion important? And then when we think about the quarantine, again, not the one today, the one that happened a few centuries ago. If we think about the quarantine, if we think about the exile of the lepers, how is this anticipating or leading up to or making way for the panopticon? In other words, what, according to Foucault, does quarantining people in the midst of a pandemic, how does that sort of lead to this notion of the panopticon, the thing we just looked at in the previous picture? After you have kind of that setup, that premise that Foucault sets up, now consider Bentham's architectural figure, the panopticon, that Foucault analyzes. I showed you one image of the panopticon. There are other ones in the text that I have on the PDF. You might want to look up some other ones too. And that's going to help you kind of understand what this thing is, what it does, what its function as an argument is, et cetera, et cetera. And remember, Google's fine for this kind of cursory research, this kind of casual research, but don't use Google for your academic essays. I'm just telling you to do this for purposes of sort of stabilizing yourself and understanding what this thing is, right? What it looks like. Google's okay for that, but don't ever use it try not to use it in an academic essay. We have the library. Okay, I digress. We've already talked about that ad nauseum. So again, make sure you understand what the panopticon is, since we're talking about argument, right? What is it as a structure? What is it as an argument? What is it as a created thing? What's its purpose? And not just what you think its purpose is, because we can riff on that. And that's what you're going to be kind of doing in your discussion board. But make sure you understand what Foucault says its purpose is too, because that's clearly important. It's, you can't just riff without understanding what the argument you're riffing on is. You have to know that first. Why is it structured the way that it is? Who benefits from it being structured in this way, and who does not benefit? Who's hurt by this? And yes, some of these answers are pretty obvious. I'm sure you're already thinking about, who those people who benefit are and who they aren't. But try to think not just within the panopticon, within the building, the structure itself, but beyond the structure. Are there people that seemingly have nothing to do with the panopticon, or are once or twice removed from it, that might benefit or not benefit from it? Again, arguments don't exist in a vacuum. They affect all sorts of things. And so we have to think, if a structure can be an argument, we can think of it in the same way, right? And then finally, this is where you get to riff. This is where you go from being able to summarize Foucault, which I'm not going to lie, can be challenging, right? Luckily, it's not too long. But this is where you go from understanding the gist of what Foucault is saying about the panopticon to then riffing on your own. So if Foucault's got this, he's analyzing this structure that Bentham originally talks about, and he's telling us all this stuff about the panopticon and its purpose and what it does, et cetera, where it comes from, yada, yada. Now let's think about it as a visual metaphor, as a stand-in, a symbol of maybe something that we're seeing in everyday life. Some of you may have read in other classes like the allegory of the cave, right? What is the panopticon an allegory for? What's it a metaphor for? And if it is, if you can think of something, tell me what that is. And riff hard. When I say riff, I mean like, you know how people like riff on guitars? Do that, but like with your brain. And if there are phenomena in our real world that are panopticon-esque or panopticon-like, then who creates this panopticon? Who are the prisoners? Who are the people who are consenting to this being there? Why is this thing or phenomenon in our present day culture or society? How might it be serving the public? How might it not be serving the public? How might it be problematic? You know, start to really think about all these things. Get your critical thought flowing. And I think that will help. I'm going to take it off. Sometimes I can talk. Sometimes I can teach. Not all the time. It's pretty ugly, but sometimes it works out. Hopefully this leaned more that way than the bad way. I'm going to take it off stop share now. As always in these videos, I like to say, if you have questions, comments, concerns, if anything comes up, feel free to message me, either email, Canvas. I know I've said on Pronto before that I can sometimes get a little lazy with the Pronto because it only shows up on my laptop and not my phone. So if I'm doing anything on my phone, I don't see the Pronto. But Canvas, email, Pronto, Zoom office hours, whatever works best for you all. I'm here to help. All right, well, I hope you all have a wonderful rest of your day, evening, or whenever it is, and I will see you in cyberspace.